Well, welcome to Parenting Great Kids, everybody. I'm Meg Meeker, your host, and today we're going to be talking about something really fun that a lot of you parents don't want to talk about, but personally, I think it's kind of fun. We're going to be talking about kids and sexuality and talking to your kids about sex. My guest is Jim Burns. He's the founder of Homeward. Some of his most popular books are Doing Life with Your Adult Children. It's fabulous. Keep Your Mouth Shut and The Welcome Mat Out. Teaching Your Children Healthy Sexuality, Confident Parenting, and Creating an Intimate Marriage. Jim, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, great to be with you.
Talk about what prompted you to talk about this specific topic.
Well, my background was that I was a youth pastor in another life, long time ago, and I found that kids needed the straight scoop when it comes to sex and sexuality. And the parents were so awkward about it because, like Kathy and me, our parents never talked to us. In fact, just last week, I was speaking in Austin, and I said to the congregation, a huge group, and I said, how many of you received good, positive, healthy sex education from your parents? And 3 people raised their hand. And so what that meant was, what I found over the years was that, and especially in today's culture when it's just so, kind of on fire and crazy, that kids really do need somebody to talk to them about the truth about it from a God-honoring way, but not from a toxic way. Because we don't know how to, as parents, we don't know how to talk about it sometimes because, again, we didn't have the good role models. Number one place kids are getting their sex education is the internet. I'm not sure I trust the internet on this one. So, there was a lot of reasons. I'm an old guy, but my wife kept saying it's time to write a book to help these kids and do it from a loving standpoint. Jesus led with love. Kindness mattered, even with people he disagreed with. And I think we've done it. I honestly think we've done something that can help these young people, if you would, make some good, right, and wise decisions that really can change their life. And talk about the master designer of sexuality in a way that's, not shameful or not, putting others down, but just simply saying, he's the master designer. Let's take a look at what he has to say.
I love it. Because often what I found is that kids look, particularly if they go to church and they are involved in a youth group and the topic of sex comes up, there's this sense that, wait a minute, this is the church. God hates sex. I'm going to be told not to have sex. So I really don't want to talk to you. And they tend to want to go to their school sex ed programs. Where have we gone wrong? Why do they get this message from church that it's ugly, they shouldn't talk about it, and just let it go?
Sure, it's dirty, rotten, ugly, sinful, and so save it till you get married. And it's going to be good. And so they're trying to turn on a dime going, I don't get this. Well, I think part of it was because it was awkward for even the church to have the conversations. When I first started talking about sex and sexuality, now again, this dates me, but it was a long time ago. It was in the 80s. And there were churches that wouldn't have me talk to kids about it because it was on sex and sexuality. Today, because we're so desperate, the church is saying, please talk about it. It's changed. Homeward's the largest provider of parenting seminars in the U.S., and our top 2, one is creating a media-safe home on digital. The other one is teaching your children healthy sexuality, right? Because the church wants it. But I think the church did come across too strong, too harsh, too shameful about something that's amazing. I mean, the church should have a better theology, what I call a theology of healthy sexuality. Theology means the study of God, but God created sex. And in the context of marriage, he sees it as beautiful and very good. And he created the joy of sexual intimacy. And I think we missed out by talking too much about how bad it is, when you're younger. And sure, there are consequences to making poor choices. Of course there are. And yet, I think earlier on in the church, maybe it was to no fault of the church because we didn't know what to do, but I think we did a lousy job of, we honestly made it look terrible. God hates sex. He doesn't hate sex. He has guardrails. Don't commit adultery, 10 commandments. He talks about a word people haven't talked about in a long time, fornication, which means sex before marriage. He talks about that. But the world has changed. So today, even when you look at cohabitation, when I was going to Anaheim High School in the shadows of Disneyland a long time ago, 75% of people said they would not live with someone before or instead of marriage. Today, it's 75% say that they would, and it's also the church. The church doesn't agree with that, but the church, within the church, they're doing it. So the world has changed. That doesn't mean we have to change. I think it means we have to recreate the way we do it. Francis Schaeffer was a theologian, and he wrote a book once where he said, the gospel doesn't change, but every generation we need to recreate how we communicate the gospel. I love that. Well, I think, what God has to say about sex and sexuality doesn't change, but the way we talk about it has to be, I think, recommunicated. And the church, I think, is finally waking up to this. I'm excited about what's going on. You mentioned youth ministry, in the world of youth ministry, in the world of where the church is now going, even when it comes to even talking about marriages. I did a marriage conference in Atlanta this weekend, and, I had a whole session on it. And, the pastor said, I'm so glad you were so open and blunt and biblical. And I love that. Open, blunt, and biblical. You can do all.
What I have found in talking to kids about sex, and I've done mostly the places I've gone to speaker in high schools, public high schools. Yeah. And it's interesting if you say, okay, we're going to have a session for the kids, 9th through 12th grade during the day, and then a session in the evening for the parents. Yeah. The kids are so excited. And parents think, well, you should separate the girls from the boys. Don't let them ask these questions. Kids could care less. They want to be talked to. And one of the things I always say to them at the beginning is sex is amazing. And then they roar and they hoot and holler. And the teacher's kind of like, what is she going to do? But when you talk with them in a positive way, they're so receptive and so responsive, and they want you to shoot straight with them. Tell me what's going on. Right. So that goes really well. And interesting, I found that afterwards, usually it's the senior boys who will come up and ask a lot of questions, because I talk about emotional fallout as well. But in the evening, I would say 10 or 15 parents show up out of a high school of 400 kids. Yeah. And it intrigues me. And I think that perhaps their parents never talked to them about it, but it seems inherently, I wonder if we have an inherent modesty about us where parents feel uncomfortable talking about something that feels very private to them, and yet it's not private in movies and so forth. So aside from the fact that we were never talked about sex, what's our problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also think that, and it's awkward. Yeah. I mean, my kids, I spoke to 250,000 kids a year on this crazy subject when I was a youth speaker. And my own daughter one time said, Dad thinks he did a good job with us, but he was so awkward. His bald head sweat, his ears turned red, he stuttered. And I went, yeah, that's true. So I think part of it when we're talking with the parents as well as with kids is just say, hey, this is going to be awkward. And for parents, it's more awkward. Parents have worries too, Meg, where one of the often asked questions for me, and it was probably for you too when you're talking to those parents, is they'll say, well, what if my kids ask me about me? Because maybe they didn't do it right, or they made wrong choices, or they brought abuse into it, or all these, there's all kinds of baggage, if you would. And they're afraid to have the conversation, partly because they're afraid that their kids are going to look them in the eye and say, well, what about you? Or what about you and Dad? Or what about, whatever. And yet I find that when they don't have to tell every story, but when they say, what, I'm passionate about this for you, because I didn't always make the good decisions. And you don't have to go through all the details. But I think for a lot of the parents, they're afraid of that. And truly, there are couples today who don't have good conversations about sexual intimacy because it was never comfortable for them to have that conversation. And that's why I think parents have to be the safe people to talk with their kids about this. And I think we need to have more and more resources for kids that, like you said, it's amazing. Yeah. And then talk about it in the context of marriage, why it's amazing. And be open to answer any question. Those senior boys coming to you, you were a safe person. One of the reasons they probably came to you is because they sensed you as safe. You're willing to talk about it, whereas they didn't see that maybe with their own mom or their own dad.
It is a hurdle that I find most parents that I've met have to get over, and they don't want to do it. So a lot of encouragement, and I often say, getting the conversation started is the hardest part. It's really not a one and done. It's like you say, it's a 100 short conversations, not one conversation that's very long. But to really help parents out, you wrote a student's guide to sexual integrity. And, I mean, that's a great resource for parents to use and kind of go through it with your kids. What about the idea of giving kids a book like that and saying, okay, I want you to read some, and then we're going to talk about it. And then read a little bit more or listen, and then we're going to talk about it. I think that might make it a little easier for parents because you're doing all the work.
Right. I'm trying to be the voice for the
Yes.
parents. However, what I really like is, say the parents give the book A Student's Guide to Sexual Integrity. The kids are going to read it because it's on sexual integrity. I mean, even boys who don't do as much reading as girls, as you well know,
Yeah.
they'll at least look at like an encyclopedia. What does this guy have to say about this or that, right? And but I think it's that dialogue, and you said it. I mean, I'd rather have 100 1-minute conversations than one 100-minute conversation. That puts us back to being safe. Now, again, you're going to get eye rolls. I mean, I have 3 daughters, so I lived a different life than you. But Christy engaged like crazy at about age 11 with my wife Kathy. Rebecca, who's now she has a master's in clinical psych, put her hands in her fingers in her ear and said, "Mom, quit this." And then she goes, "God wants you to stop talking to me about this." So she pulled the God card.
That's pretty good.
And then the youngest just said, "Hey, I know all this stuff. My sister's already told me, but yeah, lay it on me," right? And so everyone takes it different. So I think what we have to do is, I call it personally tailored discipleship. And I really think talking about morals and values is discipleship is for parents. I know a guy who just took that book, A Student's Guide to Sexual Integrity. He took it on a trip, and he and his son went from kind of like here on the West Coast where I live, went to the San Diego Padres game, and then they went to the California Angels game, and then he went to the Dodgers game, and then went all the way up to San Francisco Giants in Oakland. And in the meantime, they did the book. Well, he said we never looked at each other's face.
Right. Yeah.
And that's good. That was brilliant, because that son of his was not going to sit face to face and say, "Hey, let me ask you 100 questions." Now, he said the questions were more spontaneous. The work was more spontaneous, but he said, his son read the book, and he said it was good. And well, that's good, because it probably wouldn't have happened if they wouldn't have done this, amazing go to all the games, and by the way, we're going to talk about, now that you're 16, we're going to talk about, sex and sexuality. Great idea for
Right.
Dad.
I absolutely love it. And I think that when parents say, "I just can't do it, I just can't do it." And I like you, I say it is awkward, but you need to start the conversation, because if you don't talk about it, first of all, kids want to hear about it. Maybe they're embarrassed to hear about it from you, but they still want to hear about it. What's wrong with parents saying, "Okay, well, you're going to get sex ed in school, so I'll just let you listen to that."
Right.
What's the difference between what you do and the sex ed programs in their, say, public school?
Yeah. Well, every public school is different, but the tendency has been that they're going to pretty much go against the values of a lot of parents. So, and that has been, I mean, it's blatant today in our culture, but it was still strong years ago too. And so, who do you want giving good, healthy, positive, value-centered sex education? Do you want the school system that doesn't come from necessarily always values? They do talk about safety. So some of the things that they talk about are things that you would as a physician. And some of that is, I mean, it's not all bad, because some of that can be good, but it's not the way to do that. So I've always said that, no, don't give over one of the most important topics to your kids to somebody that has a different agenda than you. And what we've done is we've made it where, because we don't want to talk about it, they are curious. So there's a certain age comes, and that age comes pretty quick, especially when you start looking at puberty issues and things like that. You start looking at, the average boy is looking at porn around age 10, so says Google. The average girl has just moved to 11.8. I just Googled it the other day. And so do you want them getting their sex education from there, or from maybe a place that's going to say, porn is okay, and all these things that go against our values, or do you want it to be from you? And I think that's why we are making a big mistake, just saying, yeah, let somebody else do it. We would never do that for certain issues. Why are we allowing it to happen when it comes to a very important issue like sexual intimacy and sexual integrity?
One of the things that I found in reviewing a number of curricula for public schools, a lot of the teachers are uncomfortable teaching it. They're as uncomfortable as parents. And B, a lot of it is just sort of cold and calculated. This is this, and this is this, and this is this. And I think that kids can end up having a negative impression about it, even though the teachers may be trying to be positive. And my experience is that when parents talk to their kids about it, it's more positive because parents want good for their kids. They don't want them to feel ashamed. And yet a teacher, which is maybe the gym teacher talking to them about this, doesn't care so much about that. They just want to get it over with. So is that your experience that parents can communicate more positive messages about sex and sexuality?
No, exactly. And that's where, and I think parents, and I think the church has to do that. And so the church didn't do a very good job of it either. They went more like your gym teacher illustration, right? So, they can, the school system tends to go a lot with biology. And so, the kids can understand sexual systems, things like that. And they need to know that. That's not a bad thing. But why can't we also do that in the church? But the church has to also have the relational side. When kids ask me questions, they've done it all of my adult life about sexuality, they're not asking the science questions. They're saying, how far is too far? Is oral sex okay? Is that sex? I'm confused about my gender. All those are the questions they're asking, what I'm going to call the relational questions. So I think what we have to do is tackle that. And I don't think the church has done a good job of doing that. And I know that the school system and culture has done a horrible job.
Yes, because I have found too that kids, I'll talk about the physiology and then I talk about infections, of course. And kids are good with about 3 minutes of that. But what they really want to hear is, how's it going to make me feel? And I think that when you approach it from that standpoint, because it does arouse a lot of different emotional feelings, kids are there with you. Talk a little bit about, kids have never felt comfortable with their sexuality or sexual identity. And they feel very confused about both today. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, again, we have a voice in culture that's very loud today. And these kids, as opposed to a previous generation, some of the parents, they were not raised on things like social media. So today, these kids are getting incredible influence about sexuality from TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all the different social media outlets. And those people they're not dealing with the personal relationship side. So these kids they're dealing with a cultural norm that goes oftentimes against the grain of, let's say, biblical values that the parents have, or even that the kids have, but they're being bombarded with it. So I think what we have to do is say, okay, are you going to listen to the culture, which changes every 2 weeks, or are you going to listen to the words of the master designer? And, we have a course for this that kids use in youth groups and with churches. It's really a cool course. You don't see my face on it. You see these young, cool people who are kind of talking to the kids about it, like 10 minutes long each session. And one of the things we say in that is, if you were going to go to an art exhibit and you wanted to know what it really meant, you wouldn't ask your friends or just culture information. You could get some information. You would ask the master designer of that art piece if they were still alive. Well, that's what I think we've made the mistake of doing, is that the culture's so loud that we either just shout at it and say it's horrible, 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 no, 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 and then we don't really tell them why, or we don't introduce them to, there's another way to do this, and it's a beautiful way. And like, I love that you said when you were talking with kids, you go, sex is amazing.
That's what I start out my talks with, just to get just to get kids' attention, and they do. She goes, "Oh, she's on our side," kind of thing.
She's cool. No, you know what? I had a thing, and it's the same deal. I used to say to kids, on the count of 3, let's say sex is fun, because I was trying to talk about that God created sex as enjoyable. And so I would have them scream, sex is fun. Any parent who would have been in the room would have just cringed, right? But then I say, but what does the Bible say? Why is it fun? Who created pleasure? Who created this beautiful experience for marriage? And you know what? Kids need us to be honest. If you'll be honest and say sex is amazing to them, now they're going to listen to anything else you got to say to them. But if you come across too harsh or almost too angry or trying to just fit into what the culture is saying today, kids see through that.
And I think that it's easy for kids to feel shamed when you talk about it, particularly if they have a sense that the person talking to them is embarrassed, ashamed, or whatever. Now, there's a lot of sexual abuse in the culture among teenagers too.
Right.
So how does that muddy the conversation about sex, or does it? Or does it make it easier for parents to talk about?
No, I think it muddies it, and maybe easier in the sense of if there was a bad experience or somebody had a friend who had a bad experience, you say, well, let's talk. It's not this, it's this, and you talk about the beauty of it. But where I think it muddies it is if you're talking about the latest statistics that are saying potentially 1 out of 3 women by the time they're 19 have had some kind of a sexual abuse experience. Now they're running sex through a grid that was not created by God. And so they're running their sexual experience through something that really isn't a sexual, intimate experience. It's violence. And so I think that's really tough for them to then understand that there's a loving God, who created sex, because they're like, well, this Father God sure didn't do it. It so well, because my here's what happened for my stepfather, whatever it might have been. Yeah.
Yes, and I found, I don't know if you found this as well, but kids who've been sexually abused, particularly girls in their teen years, and if it's perpetrated by a person close to them, they don't want to talk about it until they're older.
No.
But talking to them about sex being positive is extremely, extremely hard. Talk about pornography. Pornography is extremely dangerous. Interestingly, I have heard young adults in their 20s, even 30s, say, what in the heck is wrong with it? I mean, come on, if it's what I want to use in my marriage, it's better than sex with my wife. What's wrong with it? So can you address pornography and what's wrong with it?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it's false intimacy. It's not real. And so what we're observing when we see porn is not even sexual intimacy. It's a actors.
Right. It's mechanical. Yeah.
And and at the same time, pornography has to be defined not just by viewing, but like, say, a lot of young women, they it might be a novel that they're reading, or other types of things, or interaction or whatever. So we're craving that. But the tough thing is that it puts us into an addiction pretty quickly. So we view pornography, then we move to pretty much wanting more. You could call that addiction. It would be a simple form of addiction. But then we move to escalation. We see it more often, and it takes over our life. We become desensitized. So what was gross 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago isn't gross anymore. And then we begin to act it out. Now we're acting out false, intimacy, if you would. And so a lot of the people, I think, who are jumping into pornography, they're settling for something so less than what God created sexual intimacy to be. And they don't know it, because it's all they know. Even as you were saying, with the 20s and 30s, the emerging adults are even moving in farther. A lot of these people, they'll ask, they'll say, what's wrong with it? Well, how's your relationship with, if they're married, with your spouse? And they're going, we're struggling with that. Well, yeah, because they're trying to imitate something that's not even real. There's 100 other reasons we could say, but for me, it's one of the things that I'm so afraid will take this generation down. Comedians, kind of mock it, because they all act like they've seen, lots of porn and whatnot. And so it becomes kind of part of the norm. But I think it destroys relationships. There is help too. I mean, if somebody who's listening today and it's their issue, or it's their issue in their marriage, or it's their 20s or 30s or whatever, there's help. And when people get help, they go, what? I didn't have any idea how this was taking me so far down. So no, I think we have to be real careful with what we put into our mind. When the Bible talks about renewing your mind for good, I always say that's the most powerful sex organ. It's not your private parts, it's your mind. And so it's a false sense of intimacy when you're involved with, pornography. Yeah. I had somebody come and talk to me this weekend. Like I was telling you, I was in Atlanta, and they said, well, we're thinking about getting a divorce because he actually likes porn more than he likes me. And he has a choice. I'm just not as exciting as what he likes to watch. And I just thought, how sad. And then we talked, and I actually talked to the guy. He actually, I think he kind of semi came around. He needs help. But to do that, he's been addicted for way too long.
Yeah, I've heard that from a number of women, and it is sad. So if a parent has an 8, 10, 12-year-old boy, and they find out he's been watching pornography, and by the way, I tell parents, your child doesn't have to look for it. If he Googles trucks or things like that, it's going to jump at him. So what do you tell a parent who's concerned because their 10-year-old has seen it and is curious and wants to go back and see it? How do you interrupt that?
Right. Well, first of all, I tell parents, if it's ever possible, don't freak out. And I know people who have gotten mad and they've broken the computer and done all those kind of things. I don't think that's helpful. But I think you want to, this is the time, whatever the marker, and you just said 8, 10, 12, whatever that age, then I think you say, I think we say, you know what, honey, real beautiful sexual integrity and sexuality created by God, it's not this, but at this stage, we're now going to walk you through what good, healthy sexuality and relationships, what that's all about. And so I think you move it from it's not this, but it's this. The deal, obviously you want to put some different filters on your computer and things like that because it's so addictive. But I think you then teach them, it gives you the chance to teach them what it is. And again, when it's 8, you have to teach them like they're an 8-year-old. When it's 10, you teach them like a 10-year-old. There's different phases that, they need to hear.
What I've found is sometimes parents get mad at the kid. And, how could you do this? And how could you do it? And they're very disturbed. And I said, well, you have to realize your kid doesn't see it the way you see it. This 8-year-old may not even know what sex is, and they're shocked.
No.
So, it's not like your 20-year-old who's watching that.
No.
So as far as, telling kids, not telling them, it's your fault, but to keep them from sort of being ashamed and say, it's normal to have these feelings of curiosity. And it's normal to say, I have no clue what that is. I'm stunned. I need to see it again. Because I think it's just so different than handling it with, adults saying, you're looking at this because you like it and you want it and so on and so forth. But for a kid, through a kid's eyes, it's very, very different. So what are some of the things that parents should say and what are the things they should not say?
Yeah. Well, again, you just said something that very few people ever talk about, and I agree so much with it, is that we oftentimes view our kids viewing pornography or our kids doing something silly or touching themselves in their privates or whatever as something more sexual because we're adults. An 8-year-old is not looking at that with some of the same sexual. They're curious and they wonder what on earth this is, and they've just seen it on YouTube, right? But the point being, when they're young, when the kids are really young and they see that, I'm not saying it's good, but I am saying you have to understand that that's not sometimes even a sexual reaction that an adult would have.
Yeah.
And for you to say that, because that's very few people talk about that. So we have to look at age development issues. So if you've got an older son who's, caught looking at porn, that's a different experience than what the 8-year-old son was. Now, again, I'm not saying it's good. You have to put, this is your time to teach them. It would be like if your, child, took off their clothes at the home and, they were touching themselves when they were 5. Well, about the time they start going to school, you got to teach them that, you don't do that at school. Right. Well, it's the same with some of this pornography stuff. And so we have to teach them guardrails. Instead of just saying, don't do it and then leave it, we have to teach them the whys and the hows to guard themselves. And that's not an easy thing. So it means it puts more work on parents today.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, you had, you didn't have access to videos and social media and all that kind of stuff. So, you were looking at maybe a magazine that somebody had, but it wasn't as just in your face.
Yeah.
And today it's in your face. Somebody said to me a couple of weeks ago, they said, my 13-year-old is kind of got addicted to porn. And it was because one of his friends said, do you want to see Miley Cyrus with her top off? And he went to YouTube.
Yeah.
And so again, is that porn? Well, she had her top off. That's not really appropriate, but it was not on a porn site. This kid then moved to craving more.
Yeah.
And so, those parents have to be able to help and teach them. That's why I think it's so important that we talk to our kids really young about it, because let's go back to the 8-year-old son and young woman too. But if at 5, I'm saying God made your body, God made boys and God made girls, I'm naming the private parts with the right names, then even that, now I'm the safe one, because it might be awkward for us, but it's not awkward for a 5-year-old. They're 5. They don't know any difference.
Right.
But
yeah.
when they see that, they may be troubled and say, Mom, I saw this thing that my friend showed me, or it popped up on the screen when I had to type in, they were 8 or whatever, and so they hardly know this, but they typed in trucks and they saw trucks with women with their clothes off or something.
Right.
Now they feel comfortable talking to you. But the mistake is that if we never talk to them about it, they're surely not going to come to us. It's going because they feel shame. There's a bit of shame when you look at porn, period. Yeah. I'm told.
Yeah.
And so if they have that shame, they don't want to come and announce that to you. When they have more of an innocence about it, they'll talk to you.
Well, and they'll feel guilty because they know, because their shame lets them know it is not good, and they're embarrassed. Right. Well, we are out of time. I could talk for a couple more hours, because I am so with you in this, that we need to talk about it to our kids in a positive way and not a negative way, because then they're going to really start to listen. My guest has been Jim Burns, and his book is Teaching Your Children Healthy Sexuality. And then he has a guide for kids, A Student's Guide to Sexual Integrity, God's Plan for Sex and Your Body. Jim, thanks so much for joining me today.
Meg, thank you. And thank you for all you do. You are the queen of parenting, and we love and appreciate you, all of us who are in this same
Well,
field.
thank you so much. I've never had anybody call me a queen, but I'll take it.
Okay. Well, you got it from me and many, many others who appreciate all that you do.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Many professionals invest in an executive coach for personal development and a trainer for physical fitness. Now you can hire me, a best-selling author and expert coach, to help you raise great kids. I've over 35 years practicing pediatrics and an extensive experience decoding what your kids need and think about you. I've helped countless parents just like you. You can talk directly with me through private or group coaching. I'll listen and provide a customized plan to help you be the best dad you can be. Sign up now through the link in the episode notes. Your kids are counting on you. Let's make your family's future brighter together.